Namaste. This is Christopher Buck, and I'm the publisher of OMTimes Magazine. Welcome to the inaugural show of What's Going On, where we will be showcasing the luminaries featured in OMTimes. Launching our first broadcast of What's Going On is the incomparable Dr. Deepak Chopra, whose accomplishments, if I were to list them all, would use most of our time this evening. Dr. Chopra is one of the major driving forces behind the ever-widening understanding of the nature of consciousness. The discussion of consciousness in the scientific community is tumultuous and with minimum consensus. Recently, it has become somewhat acrimonious as well, with the hypothesis advanced by Dr. Chopra that consciousness, and not natural selection, is the true driving force of evolution. Questioning Darwinism has provoked the ire of traditional evolutionary biologists. So who is right, Deepak or Darwin? In this episode of What's Going On, we get to speak with Dr. Deepak Chopra to gain insight into how consciousness is a driver of evolution. Dr. Chopra, thank you for taking time to speak with us today.
I'm delighted to be having this conversation.
Thank you. The community at OMTimes is very excited about this. You're currently at the epicenter of a tempest in the scientific community, which started with a statement you made, and I quote, "An emerging view, alternative to Darwin's random mutations and natural selections, is that consciousness may be the driver of complexity and evolution." You then followed this up with a statement from a recent conference in New Delhi, where you said, "Charles Darwin was wrong. Consciousness is the key to evolution, and we will soon prove that." These two statements struck at the very heart of evolutionary biology, and has started a very interesting debate among people. Several of your critics claim that the term consciousness, or your use of the term consciousness, is too vague. And I'd like to start this conversation by asking you for your definition of consciousness.
Okay, first of all, I go to conferences on consciousness all the time, and you can never get people to agree on what a definition of consciousness is. So I'll give you several and tell you how, where they come from. So a lot of people would agree, and this includes mainstream people, mainstream scientists, and I'm using the word scientist now because science until the last decade or two has not really bothered with studying consciousness. But now, of course, there are conferences on consciousness and neuroscience, consciousness and physics, consciousness and mathematics. So scientists are coming to some consensus on consciousness. The last definition I heard where scientists did agree on a definition for consciousness was consciousness is first-person experience. First-person experience. So right now, you are having a first-person experience of speaking to Deepak on the phone. And only you can have that experience. I could have a second person guessing of that experience by putting you in an MRI machine and then looking at which part of your brain is being activated. And if I had enough information, I could say, his auditory cortex is being activated. He's probably having a conversation. I could check, the various GPS devices in the world. Could even guess that you're having a conversation with Deepak Chopra, and he's in La Jolla, or Carlsbad in California. And where are you right now?
We are in Oil City, Pennsylvania.
Okay, so, given enough data, we could actually tell people what was going on right now. But that wouldn't be first-person experience. That would be, second-person description or even third-person description. So I think we all know what we mean by first-person experience. How we experience the taste of a strawberry, how we feel the emotion of a story that we read, or how we feel when we think of somebody we love, or an image that we experience somewhere in our consciousness, a sensation, a thought. That's first-person experience. So that's a good definition for consciousness that everybody agrees on. In Eastern wisdom traditions, though, consciousness is a little more than that. It's what is the source of that experience. So, we can say that experience can be perceptual, which means I see an object, I see a sunset, I see a mountain, I see another person, I hear a song, I taste chocolate ice cream, I smell a rose. So those are perceptual, you might say, experiences. In one way or another, they have to do with what we call the outside world. So you can say sound, taste, smell, texture, color, form. These are perceptual experiences. But then there's another variety of experience, which is mental. So which is just thought or emotion, or you might say an image in consciousness, or an idea or imagination. Those are also experiences, but what is the source of them? Where do they happen? Is there something prior to experience? And so Eastern wisdom traditions go further. This is when you look at the traditions of Vedanta or Kashmir Shaivism, or what Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy, or the transcendentalists. Then there's such a thing as consciousness as pure awareness, prior to perception, prior to thought, prior to mental activity. And that is the ground of being. That's the ground of existence. That's awareness. A simple way to say this would be perceptions are many, mental activities are many, but awareness is one. So there's a common ground of experience where Eastern wisdom traditions go. And that common ground is not only a common ground for you and me as human species, but for a bird, or for a tree, or for a bacterium, or for a paramecium, or for a plant, or for even a rock. So in Eastern wisdom traditions, consciousness, or a very simple form of sentience. Sentience simply means to feel and to respond, or to be aware and to respond. That sentience pervades the entire cosmos, from atom to galaxy. And in between, of course, somewhere we are part of it. So this is not a new idea. This idea has existed for as long as there's been philosophy. Plato spoke of in his cave allegory, spoke of the hidden reality, or the reality that is behind the observable world. Eastern wisdom traditions have spoken of the unmanifest domain of consciousness. In the morning, when you slowly open your eyes after a good night's sleep, before you realize you're Chris or Deepak, and that you're in the Four Seasons Hotel in Delhi or whatever, there's a moment of awareness where there is no thought content, no emotion content, not even perceptual content, cognitive content, but there's some kind of a ground of being, awareness. And then slowly, of course, or rapidly, you suddenly become aware. I'm Deepak, I'm in a hotel in New Delhi, this is what I've got to do, etc., etc. So there is consciousness prior to experience, which is the common ground of all experiences in all species, which is the definition of consciousness that I have used all my life because I've been obsessed with this subject. What is existence? What is consciousness? what is the universe. So today, there are two hard problems that are considered number one and number two in science. Number one is, what is the universe made of? And to make a long story short, the universe is mostly invisible. With dark matter and dark energy combined, that's 96% of the universe. 4% is atomic. But when we look at atoms, then those atoms are particles. And when you look at particles, they are also waves. And their waves have no units of mass and energy. And people are still struggling to define what is the universe made of, because our current science says it's made of nothing. That, when you look at the sky and you see these vast empty spaces between the stars and between you and the galaxies, these empty spaces are not really empty. They're the womb of creation. Some invisible forces are manifesting ultimately as atoms and star stuff and everything that we call material. But the vast realm of reality is sub-empirical, where the usual methodologies of science, which is measurement, observation, experimental validation, they cannot go there because there's nothing to measure. There's nothing to observe. There's nothing that you can do any experiment with. All experiment starts once a measurement is made. So, I just looked up, if you can do that yourself, type out the phrase interpretations of quantum physics or quantum mechanics in Wikipedia. You'll see one fact stands out. Quantum mechanics as a mathematical formalism stands out. It explains basically the statistical likelihood of observing particles. And it's very successful because all our technology is based on it. It's probably the most successful science. But when you look at the interpretations of quantum mechanics, you'll see there are at least at the moment 15 to 20 of them, which means we know the facts of quantum mechanics, but we don't know what it means, because we are ending up with a domain that is unobservable. And that's true of most of where science is going right now. Superstrings, a theory that can never be validated or falsified, multiple universes, a theory that can never be falsified or verified, because science has brought us to the door of the sub-empirical, or that which is beyond measurement. And that's 99.9% of reality. The 0.01% that we can observe is, in fact, somehow the manifestation of the invisible realm of the universe. And it's up for grabs. What is that invisible realm? But, you might say you have a huge, huge, huge iceberg, and the tip of your little finger is the tip of that iceberg, which is the physical observable world. So that's the number one unanswered question. And the second unanswered question in science today is, what is the biological basis of consciousness? And here there's also a problem, because everybody assumes that there's a biological basis of consciousness. And that's the prevailing scientific paradigm, that your thoughts, your imagination, your perceptions, your everything that you experience every day as your feelings, intentions, introspection, intuition, rational thought, imagination, and also everything that you experience as a perceptual world is a biological phenomenon. But there's a problem with that, because first of all, that's an assumption. Nobody has ever actually proved that biology produces consciousness or any experience. When you look at a beautiful rainbow, or you look at a golf course, or you look at a room or you look at an exquisite building with intricate architecture, all that's going to your eyes is photons. Those photons are colorless and have no dimensionality whatsoever. When they reach your eyes, your retina, or your brain, all that goes is an electric current, whether it's any of the five sensations, and all that happens in your brain is electrochemistry. You don't experience electrochemistry or photons or electrical currents. You experience a three-dimensional world which is evolving in time. And no one knows how that happens. It's called the hard problem of consciousness. Or if I ask you to imagine a beautiful sunset and you see a picture of that sunset, there's no picture of the sunset in your brain. There's just electrochemistry. So where does experience happen? Any experience. People will say it happens in the brain. You say, why? And they say, well, if you knock somebody on the head, then they lose consciousness. Or, if you give them anesthesia, they lose consciousness. Or, if they take a drug or a hallucination, they experience shift in consciousness. So consciousness must be a brain phenomenon, which is a pretty good argument, other than when you go and say, then how does the brain do it? How does the brain produce imagination or creativity or intention or any volition or a thought or even the color red, when all that comes is colorless photons, or the experience of a sound or a taste. And then we get stuck. We don't know where to go, and that is the essence of the hard problem. Now, Eastern traditions and many other systems of science or philosophy, where there is not the assumption of a physicalist ontology. Physicalist ontology means that we do not assume that the essential stuff of the universe is something physical. They'll say there's no hard problem. There is just consciousness and its excited states. And there's just consciousness and its modulations. And if that is so, then our mental experience is an excited state of consciousness. Our biology is an excited state of consciousness. And our experience of the world is an excited state of consciousness. And so there is no hard problem. You're just assuming that the world is physical. If you assume that the world is consciousness, then the universe is consciousness as well. It's the objective experience of consciousness, as is our biology, etc. So then if this is true, if this philosophical assumption or ontology is true, then we are a species of consciousness, as is a microbe, as is a bacterium, as is a paramecium, as is a monkey, etc. And then the evolution of species is, in fact, the evolution of species of consciousness. And we are all conscious agents coming from one universal domain of consciousness. And that would be a new interpretation of evolution. I think Charles Darwin's great contribution was that he introduced the word evolution. Now, when I use this as a consciousness being a driver of evolution, of course, my critics immediately jumped on, putting me in the same bandwagon as creationists. When I have written articles in the past on creationism and why I believe it's not a viable theory of at all, but just an excuse for dogmatic religious agendas. So definitely, I'm not propounding a creationist theory. I'm just saying evolution is true, but evolution of species is evolution of species of consciousness. When Darwin wrote his theory of origin of species, he had no knowledge of DNA or genetics. He had no idea that such a discipline as epigenetics would come, which has only come in the last decade or so. He had no idea of how genes get activated or expressed or regulated. So, yes, random mutations was a good theory coupled to natural selection. But if you talk to evolutionary biologists today, some good ones, not all of them, by the way, because they're all 99% of them are wedded to the old mechanistic paradigm. But when you talk to biologists like, say, Rudy Tanzi, with whom I'm doing a book called Supergenes, he's the director of the genetics lab at Mass General Hospital, and he's also, chaired professor of neuroscience at Harvard Medical School. When you talk to him or other people of his caliber, they say that mutations don't seem to be random at all, that mutations follow certain probability patterns, and that, they have a distribution pattern, and they don't seem to be random. A better word to use would be an individual mutation can be unpredictable. But when you look at the multiple mutations, they follow a distribution pattern. And of course, natural selection I have no problem with. The mutations that dominate get naturally selected for propagation. So the question is, are mutations random, or they're just unpredictable on an individual level, but is there a probability distribution, and is there room even for teleology, which means purpose-driven mutation? Random is a convenient word. If I go to Grand Central Station or Penn Station, I see all the people out there. They seem to be moving about randomly. I come every day and I see that, so many people are going to Boston, so many are going to Philadelphia, so many are going to Washington, D.C. In fact, I could even plot a distribution pattern and create a business plan out of it. Are mutations like that? Can I plot a distribution pattern and say there's the evolution of species going on with natural selection, but that evolution of species is driven in a direction of complexity and purpose. This is dangerous ground to tread in if you're with traditional biologists, because they will immediately accuse you of creationism and teleology and all the old terms that they're hackneyed by now, that are used to attack the most traditional model of evolution. Evolution right now needs revision. I've just written this book with Rudy Tanzi, Supergenes, where we have an entire chapter devoted to evolution, mind, and consciousness. But we are doing studies at our own center here, where we take people through various practices of meditation, and then we look at their gene expression. And it changes. It changes because of epigenetic modulation, which means that epigenes are these factors outside the gene, and then actually the epigenetic information is all there in a sheath of proteins outside the genome. And this is influenced by everything. It is influenced by thought, by stress, by relaxation, by meditation, by diet, by sleep, by emotions. So for the first time, we now have a very clear handle on mind, brain, genome, and even microbiome. So 90% of the genetic information in your body is bacteria. This includes your gut and your skin. 90% of your DNA is bacteria. Only 10% is human. And even in the human cells, the 10%, the human cells that you have, the mitochondria, which are the energy-producing organelles in your cells. So even the mitochondria in the human cells are derived from bacteria. I would say you are, as a human being, the awakening in consciousness of bacterial colonies. They got together, they produced human beings, and they said, okay, who am I now? Let's start talking about consciousness itself. So, we can now show that your thoughts, your emotions, your mental activity, which obviously comes from your consciousness, is influencing the behavior of your genes, not only the human genes, but your microbial genes. We are getting all this data together. We have a study right now that we've completed on meditation and what happens to gene activity. And we have scientific partnerships with cell biologists from Harvard, from UCSF, from UCSD, from Scripps, and from Duke University, collaborating on a paper on how meditation influences gene activity. You obviously you do not change the sequence of the nucleotides on your DNA. It remains the same. But you do definitely regulate the activity of your genes, and actually epigenetic factors, including emotions and stress, will influence gene activity in subsequent generations. So if you look at experiments where they take mice and they have them smell something like wintergreen and they give them electrical shocks, then the next generation of mice will be afraid of the wintergreen smell, even though they haven't experienced the electrical shock. Or if you go to a cow farm or a cattle farm and you see cattle that are enclosed in with the wiring that has electrical fence around it, and so they get mild electrical shocks, then the subsequent generations will be afraid and will not go near that wiring. How does memory get transferred? We all assume that memory is in our brain, but and of course there are neural correlates for memory that you can look at. If I ask you to remember the face of your mother, or the location of your house, or what you had for dinner yesterday, when you do that, there will be activity in your brain that I can look at. But where is the memory at a cellular level before I asked you that question? And nobody is able to answer that. Where is the cellular imprint at the basis of chemistry in cells? Your synaptic networks are merely on-off switches. So where are memories recorded, and how are they transferred? Because in the examples I gave you with mice and cattle, they are being transferred. If they were in the brain alone, how would they be transferred? Epigenetically, we don't know yet. My theory is that all memories are in consciousness, and consciousness is not in the brain. Consciousness at the very fundamental level is sentience that pervades the entire universe. So if you read Freeman Dyson's book, Infinite in All Directions, towards the end he addresses some very interesting questions. He says, every quantum experiment forces the atom to make a choice. That, in fact, atoms have some degree of sentience right there because, they're hanging out with other atoms, particles are hanging out with other particles, and they're in a relationship with other particles. Otherwise, you couldn't get to atoms and molecules, etc. So there's some form of sentience. Obviously, bacteria have sentience. They look for good food. I mean, I take probiotics or fiber, so I can multiply the probiotics, the good bacteria in my gut, and they don't like toxic substances like petroleum products and insecticides. So there's a degree of sentience in bacteria, and there is sentience in unicellular organisms like a paramecium. It avoids toxins, looks for food. It even has sex. It doesn't have a brain. And you got to go a long way up the evolutionary scale till you get to what do you call reptiles and rodents and then amphibians before you get a brain. And then, of course, there are several levels of brain. You have the reptilian brain, you have the limbic brain, you have the cortical brain. But there's a long line of living organisms, from bananas to pineapples to trees to other plants, which display sentience. They look for sunlight. They eat the nutrients of the earth. They communicate with each other. They reproduce. Is this not a form of sentience? Why is sentience the privilege of a brain? Why do you need a brain? In my debate with Richard Dawkins, which I don't know if you saw or not, but
I did.
I'm happy to send it to you. But I said sentience is there in the universe, and of course, he lost his temper. He accused me of what he called willful obscurantism. He said sentience is an emergent property, and he basically very staunchly defended the prevailing worldview. But I'm sorry to say he's wrong. There's, as Freeman Dyson said, there's three riddles, he said, that have confused him all his life. Freeman Dyson is one of the most eminent physicists of our time. At
Yes.
Princeton, he's now over 90. But he said, first is the unpredictable movement of atoms. The second is a universe that's friendly to life and mind. And the third is our own consciousness. And then he goes on in this book to say, Infinite in All Directions, that some form of sentience, it seems to pervade the entire cosmos. And we are also part of it. So here's my theory. And the theory is that evolution of species is evolution of species of consciousness, that consciousness is the trigger for evolution, that different species are almost like archetypal ideal forms in the Platonic realm of consciousness that actually then evolve seemingly in time, but you could actually see that in some way the gaps in evolution, the so-called gaps, could be creative leaps of consciousness into complexity and emergence. Scientists use these words, complexity and emergence, all the time. And then you ask them what drives the complexity. They don't have an answer. They say, oh, it's an emergence. So what derives the emergence? Oh, it's a complexity. Well, there's got to be some driver of that. It's a cop-out. It's a total cop-out, this using complexity to dismiss what you don't know, and also being afraid of introducing teleology into evolution. Now, last month, and then I'll finish with this. Last week actually, I was at a conference in Helsinki. There were 700 people there, and the conference is about the science of, it's called Towards the Science of Consciousness. And I made my case over there for everything I've told you. And I'm happy to send you my abstract. Obviously, the traditional mechanistic people totally disagreed with me. But I am rallying now all people who can be sympathetic towards this idea. And what I'm finding is there are a lot of biologists in the closet and a lot of scientists in the closet who are slowly going to come out and favor this worldview.
I agree. I personally think that the definition of consciousness is, and I'm sure the scientific community would hate this term, one of the current holy grails of the scientific community, to be able to define that.
Yes.
But I also know it's, for example, and you touched on this earlier, that we reach levels of scientific advancement, which then allows us to measure and test and define things that we just could theorize about before. We couldn't actually take it to the next level. For example, before the Hadron Collider, we couldn't prove the existence of quarks, which are the building blocks of protons and neutrons, although we we thought there would be something. My next question would be, how do you see us in the understanding of consciousness, and in your opinion, what steps or advances do we need to get to where we can scientifically define consciousness?
Okay, just coming back here, Hadron Collider, when you measure these particles, whether it's quarks or whatever, what you're really measuring is a space-time event in your consciousness. These quarks, these subatomic particles are fleeting events. And by the time you've kind of even measured it, the event is no longer there. That's the ephemeral nature of subatomic particles that are simultaneously spread out as waves and as particles. We're still trying to figure out what is the essential, fundamental nature of these things that we call things, but they have no thingness about them. And, what we do is we study inferentially. A lot of what we study now is inferential. So in the case of consciousness, well, if we are conscious beings studying consciousness, then we'd have to go back to the traditional spiritual traditions that would say only consciousness can know consciousness, only consciousness can explain consciousness, only consciousness can know consciousness. And that is through spiritual practice. But we can get a very good idea of consciousness inferentially by looking at what happens in the brain when you have a thought, by looking at what happens in the brain when you have an emotion, by looking at the biological correlates of shifts in consciousness with emotions, with love, with compassion, with joy, with equanimity, with creativity. We can look at biological expressions, and then we can make inferences from that. So all scientific study of consciousness will have to be at some level inferential, which is what we're doing. The direct experience of consciousness is self-awareness, because the self is a conscious being. And, sentience may pervade all other species, but we are the only species that says, who am I? I don't think, other species are asking that question, even though they have sentience. So when we get to the consciousness of consciousness, which is a human trait, then we develop techniques for exploring consciousness. I cannot predict what the future science will bring, but right now, even things like fMRI and all them, they're very indirect. All they measure is blood flow to the brain. So I think now that we are looking at inflammatory markers here, we are looking at epigenetics, we're looking at the microbiome, we are definitely studying consciousness.
It's absolutely fascinating what all is going out there right now. Another aspect of the scientific process is falsifiability, which is the potential for a theory to be proven incorrect. In your opinion, what evidence would invalidate your theory of consciousness?
So what was I saying? So the methods of studying biology will definitely evolve. And also there are mathematical models for looking at evolution, which, scientists and mathematicians, physicists and mathematicians are looking at. If you want, I can refer you to a cognitive scientist. His name is Donald Hoffman, and he's developing mathematical models for evolution of consciousness. And he may or may not be willing to talk to you about, but he just gave a TED Talk. In fact, I can send you a link to his TED Talk, and then you can decide whether you want to talk to him or not.
That'd be fabulous. One last question. Then one other thing is, can you think of any evidence that might invalidate your theory of consciousness?
Can I take any? First of all, all of science is about proving previous theories wrong. So falsification is the way we have come to where we are. Our current theories are just current. They're going to inevitably, if you're going to proceed further, they have to be falsified. So falsifiability is a good case in point. Here's my problem with some of the philosophies of science, including falsifiability. Most of reality is sub-empirical, and science does not at the moment look at the sub-empirical world because it doesn't have the tools to do it.
Well,
how do you design experiments to validate or falsify where transactions in a world where there's nothing to see, there's nothing to observe? Consciousness, we should end with this definition. In the Vedanta, they say consciousness, how do you define it? They say that which cannot be seen, but without which there is no seeing. That which cannot be heard, without which there is no hearing. That which cannot be perceived, without which there is no perceiving. That which cannot be thought of, but without which there is no thinking. That which cannot be imagined, but without which there is no imagination. So, consciousness is dimensionless. And being dimensionless, it is the ground and substance of all that is in the world of dimensions. This idea is so foreign to people who are only basically looking at the world of dimensionality.
Oh, thank you. This has been a truly enlightening conversation, and I very much appreciate your time. I did have one last thing I wanted to ask you. On you've got a 21-day free meditation experience with Oprah coming up on July 13th. Can you briefly share what you're doing
This one is on gratitude and grace. And so what we're saying is when you open your heart to gratitude, you become, you're open then to the grace and wonders of the universe of which you are a part.
Well, thank you. I know I will be participating. I'm sure many of our readers will also.
Okay, I'll send you some material, okay? My office has your email, right?
Yes, the office has my email, and thank you again for your time. It's been quite an honor.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.